Welcome to Watchtower History. For years, I've been very interested in the Nazi persecution of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I've collected several films, documentaries, and books on the subject. There's a lot of different aspects that can be looked at for this particular subject, but we'd like to look at the positive aspect in this particular discussion. You know, how did the Jehovah's Witnesses stand firm against Nazi persecution? Because they really did. They were quite an example to a lot of the prisoners around them. And so we're going to look at some of those examples. We're going to talk about how the Jehovah's Witnesses stood firm and see quite an example of what's going on there and how the scholars and the documentation have talked about this period of history. I think it'll make for a very interesting discussion.
The story of the witnesses is beginning to be better known, but we still have an enormous amount of work we have to do to understand the full depths, limits, and connections of the story of the witness to those of other victims of the Holocaust.
The position of the Jehovah's Witnesses is a unique position of Christians of all kinds in Nazi Germany. It stands by itself. People living in Germany knew who the Jehovah's Witnesses were and knew what they stood for.
Totalitarian rule is the product of Satan.
As a group, whether it's a formal church or a smaller group, as far as my research goes, only the witnesses made the consistent stand and the dramatic stand that they did.
On March 22nd, 1933, a mere 51 days after Hitler became Chancellor and a full 6 years prior to the start of World War II, Dachau concentration camp opened its gates and closed them forever on those who lost their lives there. It was the first in a system that would explode by the end of the war to include more than 1,500 camps and would be responsible for the unprecedented annihilation of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children.
The history of Jehovah's Witnesses, how they stood firm in their beliefs, and how they spoke out, is a record few have heard about today. It is a story that must be told.
This has been mentioned several times in a lot of articles in Watchtower. Before the Divine Purpose History book was written, they did have a series of articles in the 1950s called The Modern History of Jehovah's Witnesses, and they talked about this period as well, this foreign activities under fascist Nazi persecution, because they did a lot of door-to-door witnessing at the time while they could, and even while it was forbidden. In the 1920s and 30s, the Bibelforscher, as the JWs were then known in the German language, they distributed large amounts of Bible literature. It's said that between 1919 and 1933, they placed an average of 8 books, booklets, or magazines with each family in Germany. So that's really quite an accomplishment. They were, Germany had one of the largest movements of the Bible students in Europe at the time.
Well, and not to put a negative context into it, because we want to keep this one more positive, admiring some of the work they did. But you look at during the Hitler time, right before it, remember a lot of how Hitler came to power was the nations pummeled Germany during World War I. And they were suffering, for lack of a better word. They weren't prospering, like they could have been. So you're talking, once again, bringing a message of hope to people who are in despair. So you'll have a lot of success. People want, you know what, God's going to help. I'm watching certain people today that I know who, following on Facebook, watching their posts, are with whatever going on in their lives, they're frustrated with the costs of rent, fuel, food, are making posts of Jesus. You know, they're getting to God. When you have the conditions you had that Hitler rose to and rose from and got his people on board, the Jehovah's Witnesses were doing the same thing, but from a religious angle, whereas Hitler was coming at it from a national political level to conquer. And
you know,
they actually got tied together down the
Yeah.
road, but we'll go there another discussion.
I like a couple of these articles. What every school principal should know about Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, they said that a Jewish newspaper printed a story in 1993 where the school principal was uninterested about hearing from the witnesses. And so they were trying to give the story behind the name and what had happened. It's a story that has to be told. And, you know, here's a story behind the name. There's actually a street named after one of the witnesses who died. So the Holocaust Chronicle teases just a little bit about this story. I mean, literally just this one strip. They don't talk about it very much. And they say basically that from 1933 to 1945, the Nazis imprisoned 10,000 Jehovah's Witnesses and executing more than 200 for refusing military service. As many as 5,000 died in concentration camps. But despite persecution, witnesses clung fervently to their religious beliefs, which did not allow bearing of arms, and they steadfastly refused to swear allegiance to the Nazi state.
Now, I've said this before, Jeff. Being a young boy in my age group, when I was young, I still got to see from my grandmother and her friends that were the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I said this before, that generation that came out of the World War II are in the Jehovah's Witnesses were a whole other breed, a whole other mindset. Even if they weren't anointed, they were more focused on the end of the world is coming tomorrow. But they didn't, I guess they didn't have a lot of the stresses they have today, so they could focus on it more. You know, a father could make a living and the wife could assist in preaching and getting him in so he could do more. So it was a different type of mindset. So what they did go through over there, I remember them talking about, you know, the war and what happened over there firsthand. Of people that my grandmother knew who were in Germany, who were doing that. So that is commendable. I can't, whether they were doing it for the right reason or whether they should, you know, that's a whole other story, but they did not back down in most cases.
And, you know, they were one of the first outside of the Jewish people to be persecuted. There's a book I bought at the Holocaust Museum, and it's by Professor Detlef Garbe, and it's called Between Resistance and Martyrdom, Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich. And Professor Garbe says, besides the Jews, the Jehovah's Witnesses were the first religious denomination in the Third Reich exposed to serious persecution. These quick and massive actions against Jehovah's Witnesses did not only have the objective of resisting a group that the National Socialists had considered to be subversive for quite a long time, they also reflected an effort on part of the state to reach an agreement with the two predominant churches in Germany. In the same way that the churches applauded the actions the NS state took against guideless propaganda, communist organizations, and social democratic free-thinking associations, they considered the actions taken against the Bible students as evidence that the new state took seriously the promises that the Reich Chancellor had made in his March 23, 1933 government declaration regarding his protection of the two Christian confessions. And so we'll get into the timeline of Hitler's rise to power, what happened previous in the early years before Hitler came to power, and what happened after. we'll look at a detailed timeline of how the witnesses were persecuted right along with the Jews, and how they were slowly changing the rules and taking a little bit more and a little bit more away from them until they ended up in the camps. Very, very sad story.
What's that you got there, Jeff?
This is something I bought at the Holocaust Museum. I thought it would be interesting to share with the audience. You know, it's Zeugen and Jehovah's, 1933 to 1945, and the Purple Triangle.
When I was in Germany, I went to the Holocaust Museum, and that'll leave an impression on you. I mean, if you're just be neutral, don't be pro-Zion, anti-Zion, or whatever, just go in there to do what they did to those people, any group, whether it be Ukraine or whatever, Ukrainian. The main thing was the uniforms they were put in just stood out. So a lot of the Purple Triangle had to do with the Christians, in my mind, the Christians who stood up to the Nazi resistance and whatnot. It's a more of a reflection on the uniform.
So what does the Purple Triangle mean? If its moral significance is widely remembered in time, wrote Professor John K. Rother in his book, Holocaust Politics, the Purple Triangle can yet be a shield against disaster, a shield whose triangular points direct our attention and commitment towards the good that most deserves human respect. You know, as you said, you were going to the Holocaust Museum. I've been to several of the Holocaust museums here in the United States. I've been to Auschwitz a couple of times. And when we went to see Schindler's List in the theater, I remember being so shell-shocked by the end of that film that the entire audience, the auditorium was packed. And the entire audience, after the film was over, not a single word was stated. Everyone was just completely silent. Just letting it sink in what happened. It really had an impact on my life that made me want to look into this story more. Why were the Jews persecuted? Why were the JWs persecuted? We'll get into that in a future discussion. You know, there are many scholars and news reports that do make this story known, but, you know, most of the public don't really know that the Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted. And so that's why a lot of times they're described as history's forgotten victims. And, you know, in the Stand Firm film, in the introduction, it says it's a story that needs to be told. And there's a lot more to this story that needs to be told. And we'll get into that in future discussions. But it's very, very important to focus on the faith that these individuals had and how they stood firm against this incredible persecution that they suffered. Whether that faith is right or wrong, the JWs were convicted in their stand for their faith. So in the introduction to the Stand Firm film, you know, they've had different conferences, and that Professor Detlef Garbe says that we Jehovah's Witnesses and non-Jehovah's Witnesses, he is not a Jehovah's Witness, mind you, should not be allowed to forget the history of the prisoners with the Purple Triangle. This was a beam of light in a dark age. And his book is, you know, almost 900 pages long. It's a very, very long book, but it's full of details, Nazi documents, translated, all the evidence you could possibly ever want on this particular subject, all in one source. You know, this is a very important question that has to be asked from the November 22nd, 1987 Awake. Yeah, somebody's sent a letter to Pope John Paul II, an open letter. And he says, is it possible, Your Holiness, that in Waldheim's forgetfulness, there is an echo, however distant, of the church's forgetfulness as well? You know, there was a long history of Jewish persecution by the church for the last couple thousand years. You know, there's a book, Constantine's Sword, which actually looks at a lot of the history of the Jewish persecution that was instituted a lot of times by the church. It wasn't just the Catholics. A lot of the Protestants did it as well. Luther, also very, very anti-Semitic. And a lot of Luther's anti-Semitism was a whole part of that whole German consciousness. You know, a lot of times the example of the witnesses, they even got grudging admiration even from those who jailed them. Professor Garbe, he says, because their nonconformity was often perceived as stubbornness, beyond all rational considerations, admiration easily turned into lack of understanding and rejection. So sometimes their ability to stand firm because of their faith wasn't just a reason that people admired them, but also a reason people despised them as well. Professor Garbe says, the broad range of feelings that this subject involves is vividly reflected in the reports of fellow prisoners of Jehovah's Witnesses. And there's some interesting statements here. With an unbelievable steadfastness, these people endured year after year after year the most atrocious mistreatment. However, they did not disown or betray their faith. To the contrary, even here in the camp, they persistently tried to persuade other prisoners to accept their ideas. I have to admit, these people commanded my admiration. Another one, their stubborn attitude certainly did not impart any exemplary strength because it was not built on solid ground. They definitely deserved our respect, but we also felt sorry for them. The SS considered these men as lunatics. But in Waibling, when food supplies were exhausted, our 8 Bible students came together and read a Bible verse. These lunatics reflected human dignity. So at least they recognized some of the good things they were doing, even if they thought they were crazy or the ideas were crazy.
And putting a picture of what people don't realize, toward the end of the war, Germany was suffering.
Yeah.
And here is, they're wiping out German boys left and right, German men left. I mean, they're depleting the male German population. I don't want to be misquoted on this, but I think it toward the end of the war, they were taking 12-year-old boys, giving them guns and doing, if I remember correctly on that. But I remember they were taking young boys into the military like that. Now here you have the nation now really suffering the war. They thought they were going to conquer, and here's these guys not fighting for it. We're dying for our cause, and you're here not doing it. That's a herd mentality that often kicks in during times of crisis like that. They did. There's no question. They did stand out as something different in every way, religious, politically, even war effort.
It's quite admirable how they endured that persecution. Sometimes with joy, because it just was evidence for them that, they were being persecuted, that was the faith, because Jesus said, you will be persecuted. And so they took those things with joy. Some of the stories that you read in these scholarly books, in the Watchtowers, they're admirable. They're really good, strong examples. I have to ask myself, would I do the same thing? In Hesse's book, Hans Hesse's book, Persecution and Resistance of Jehovah's Witnesses During the Nazi Regime, his foreword says that no Christian community can even stand the slightest comparison with the number of their martyrs. The history of Nazi persecution of this group was increasingly overlooked. And Hesse's book is really a compilation of multiple scholars looking at this, and each one of these scholars is looking at a different perspective. This Christoph, in his Solidarity and the Will to Survive, Religious and Social Behavior, of Jehovah's Witnesses. He says the survivors' statements are so much alike that it seems as if they had copied each other. And that, you're interviewing all of them separately and, 1,000 of them, and they're all telling the same story. It's like the 4 different gospel accounts, right? You're all telling the same story and looking at it from another perspective, but the testimony agrees. It says they admired the Bible students' firmness of faith, which never left them in doubt whether there was a God, even though for other prisoners, Jews as well as Christians, he had, in view of this crime, abandoned his creation long ago.
As I said before, I never took to the Jehovah's Witness, but I grew up around it. My grandmother was a very firm witness in that World War II period, in the United States, of course. But she had if I remember, a Polish friend, and I remember her name, we used to call her Sister Paulus. Even the neighborhood kids, when she came over, would go, "Hey, Sister Paul," she's the woman. If I remember, she was from Poland and lived through all that, and they somehow immigrated to America. But this woman, I will say it was persecution of going to be a Christian, to be a Jehovah's Witness for that. So a lot of these people in that time frame did stand up and did take a different stand than people would today. So I can see how looking back at those people, and you and I are of an age where we would have a memory of them.
Yeah. I met at our school, they would always bring in, when we were kids, survivors, Jewish survivors, and to talk to the kids, to tell the story. And, as a kid, I don't think you really understand what they really went through. And, a kid is a kid, but it does have an impact. When we went to Auschwitz a couple of years ago, we had to decide if we were going to take our son, who was 12 at the time. And we weren't sure. He's a very sensitive boy. We weren't sure it was going to be a good idea, but we thought, we're so close. It's important to go. It's important for him to see and to experience where this happened. And he came out of that changed. He was very interested in reading some of the stories. And I had him read stories about both Jews who were there, and because I have so many of the books here on my shelf, I gave him Simone Leifster's book, Facing the Lion, because that's written more for, what a child, because she was a child. She was 12, exactly his age. So it really made him think. When we went to the Detroit Holocaust Museum, they have a tree there that is a sapling from the Anne Frank tree. And he just wanted to sit there under that tree for an hour. He didn't want to go anywhere. He just wanted to stare at that tree because the Anne Frank book and that story was an impact on him.
Well, they made us read that in school. I don't know if they're still making the kids do that or that's an option. I don't know, but we had to read it. They wanted us to know what happened over there. Now so much it's forgotten.
But it's important for people to learn the story, and not just the Jews. The Jews really suffered more than anyone else. 6 million died, but there were more groups, not even just the Jehovah's Witnesses. Because this is a Watchtower History channel, we're going to focus on the Jehovah's Witness story. We'll get into a little bit on the Jewish story a little later on, but this story is generally forgotten when the story of what the Nazis did happened. And we're going to look at some of the reasons why the Nazis persecuted the Jehovah's Witnesses in a future discussion. This Professor Christoph says that the moment one stepped through the camp gate, the first few hours, the first few days in the camp were the most traumatic for prisoners. Beatings by guards, disinfection, depilation, assignment to frequently overcrowded barracks, nutrition and hygienic conditions were degrading and irritating for civilized persons, and today can barely be rationally understood. They entered the camps as strangers, where the names became numbers. They had been torn from families, friends, acquaintances, and other related persons. This traumatic experience could only be moderated if they met other prisoners who initiated them into new survival rituals and cared for these totally disoriented newcomers. And so there's a story about a young Jewish prisoner, a Czech tailor, who told one of these stories. And he says, when we Jews from Dachau came to the barrack, the other Jews hid what they had so that they would not have to share. You're shaking your head, but this is the way that it was. Outside, we helped each other. But here, where everything's a matter of life and death, everyone wants to save himself first, and he forgets about others. What do you think the Bible students did? They had to work hard at repairing a water pipe. In this cold weather, they had to stand in icy water all day long. No one understands how they can stand it. They say that Jehovah gives them the strength for this. They urgently need their bread. They are as hungry as we are. But what did they do? They put all the bread together, took one half for themselves, and put the other half aside for their fellow believers who had just arrived from Dachau. And they welcomed and kissed them. They prayed before they ate. And they all had radiant and happy faces afterwards. They said that no one was hungry anymore. You see, I said to myself then, these are true Christians. This is the way I had always imagined them. Why can't we be this way? How nice it would have been if our brothers had prepared such a reception for us.
Now, this is written by a non-Jehovah Witness. So for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who might be watching what we're doing with this, our take on this, we're reporting what others have seen too. We're taking a non-biased look. Let's let the facts speak for themselves. Whether they were right or wrong enough to go through what they went, that's not the point. We're not pointing to that at this time on this. We're talking about what they actually went through and the fact that they allowed themselves to go through that. And that we have to say is commendable.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And some of these stories are amazing.
And others who are never been Jehovah's Witnesses notice the same thing.
Yeah, very incredible stories of courage, I could say. But I think it really puts into perspective when you see literally just 2 or 3 days after Hitler comes to power, he's already going after the Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses. That was a shock to me. I had no idea it was that soon. Knowing what we know why,